The courthouse on Peachtree Center Avenue had been there for 40 years, and in those 40 years it had heard a great many things. Confessions, denials, verdicts that changed the shape of people's lives in the space of a single sentence. The building did not remember any of it. Buildings did not remember. But the people who passed through its doors carried the memory with them when they left, and sometimes they carried it for the rest of their lives. On the morning of the 14th of November, 3 girls walked through those doors together. The oldest was 17. Her name was Simone, and she walked the way she had walked since she was 14, with the deliberate steadiness of a person who had decided early that the world would not see her falter, who had made stillness into a form of armor and worn it so long it had become her natural posture. She was tall, with her mother's cheekbones and her father's eyes, and she carried a manila folder under her arm that she had organized the night before with the precision of someone who understood that preparation was the only form of control available to her in situations where the actual decision was being made by other people. The middle one was 14. Her name was Brianna, and she was the opposite of Simone in the way that middle children sometimes became the opposite of their older siblings, not because she was less capable, but because she had learned early that the space immediately behind her sister was already occupied, and so she had moved sideways into her own territory. Brianna was loud, where Simone was quiet, specific, where Simone was comprehensive, and she was walking through the courthouse doors right now, with her jaw set in a way that their aunt walking behind them recognized immediately as the exact expression their father made when he was afraid and determined not to show it. The youngest was 9. Her name was Cora, and she was holding Brianna's hand with both of hers, and she was not pretending to be anything other than what she was, a 9-year-old in a courthouse who was frightened and who wanted her father. Their aunt, Denise Washington, was 44 years old and a social worker in the Fulton County school system, and she had been through the inside of courthouses before, not as a party, but as a professional observer, the person who showed up when children needed an adult who was not compromised by the situation. She was good at it. She was good at the particular form of presence it required, which was being fully there without taking up more space than the situation warranted, without inserting her own fear or her own grief into a room where someone else's fear and grief were already doing all the work they could do. She was finding it harder this morning than she usually found it, because the person sitting in the holding room somewhere in this building was not a stranger's client. He was her brother. She put her hand briefly on Simone's shoulder as they passed through the security checkpoint. Simone did not turn around. She kept walking, the folder under her arm, her posture, the posture of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and had gotten very good at making the carrying invisible. Denise followed her nieces through the metal detector and thought about the 14 months that had brought them to this morning, and she thought about her brother. And she thought about the particular cruelty of a situation in which you could be certain of someone as innocent and powerless to make that certainty count. She had been certain from the first day, from the Tuesday morning in September, when Marcus had called her from the firm's parking lot, his voice very controlled in the way it went controlled when something was very wrong, and told her what had happened. She had been certain, and she had stayed certain through the bail hearing and the preliminary proceedings and the months of motions and delays that had stretched the family across a long year like a wire pulled taut and not yet broken. Certainty was not a legal argument. Certainty did not stop the months from passing or the legal fees from accumulating or the girls from learning. Over 14 months would have meant to live in the state of suspended crisis that a criminal trial imposed on a family. Certainty was what you held on to privately, in the hours that were too early or too late for practical action, when there was nothing to do but hold it and wait. She followed her nieces into the courtroom and sat down in the gallery row behind the defense table, and Cora climbed up next to her and pressed against her side, and Denise put her arm around her youngest niece and looked at the back of her brother's head at the defense table, and she waited too. Marcus Washington had been in the legal system for 14 months. And in those 14 months, he had learned things about himself that he had not known before. He had learned that he was capable of a quality of sustained composure that he would not have predicted he possessed. He had sat through hearings in which his character was described in terms that bore no resemblance to any version of himself he recognized, in which the prosecution's account of his motives and actions was built from the same facts that constituted his actual life, but assembled into a shape that he would not have known if he encountered it alone. And he had kept his face arranged in the particular way Carol Reeves had instructed: attentive, calm, human, present, because jurors were watching all the time. She had told him, and what they were watching was not just the evidence, but the person the evidence was about. And the person the evidence was about needed to look like a person and not like a performance of a person. He had learned that fear was not a single thing. It arrived in different forms at different hours, as a specific cold wave at 3 in the morning, as a kind of flatness in the middle of the day that had a texture different from ordinary tiredness, as a sudden sharp particular panic that came without warning, like the moment 6 months ago when Brianna had called from school to tell him she'd made the honor roll, and he had sat in his apartment afterward with the phone in his hand, thinking about the years he might not be present for, the recitals and the graduations, and the ordinary Tuesday evenings that were not events, but were the substance of a life. He had learned that his daughters were more than he had understood them to be, not more than he had loved them. He had always loved them completely. That had never been in question, but more than he had seen. Simone had become, in the months since the arrest, a person he was simultaneously profoundly proud of and quietly frightened for. Proud because she had taken on a weight that was not hers to carry, and was carrying it with a competence and steadiness that he recognized as something she had built herself, by herself, out of the raw materials of her own character. Frightened because no 17-year-old should have to build that. Because the strength she was displaying was real and was hers, and was also the consequence of something that had happened to her that she had not chosen and had not deserved. Brianna had become fiercer and more specifically protective, as though she had identified the threat to the family and had taken up a position between it and everyone she loved, and was not going to be moved from that position. She had organized the household in a way that left Denise more room to rest and Simone more room to study. And she had done this without being asked and without announcing it, which was the specific kind of competence that was harder to develop than the announced kind. And Cora was still Cora, still fundamentally herself, still the child who believed that people were mostly good and that problems were mostly solvable. And Marcus held on to this with both hands because it meant that the damage had not gone all the way down, that the youngest and most unprotected of the three of them had somehow retained the quality of a child who had not yet been fully disabused of her faith in things working out. Their mother had died when Cora was 4. Cancer. Fast, aggressive, the kind that did not negotiate and did not allow for the slow rearrangement that some illnesses permitted. Marcus had been widowed at 36 with 3 daughters aged 11, 8, and 4, and he had looked at those 3 daughters in the weeks after the funeral and made a decision that he had never articulated out loud, but had held to with the specific, daily, renewable commitment of someone who understood that the decision was not made once, but was made again every morning. He was not going to fall apart, not permanently. He was going to grieve, because grief was real, and it was necessary, and refusing it was a form of dishonesty. And he did not want to model dishonesty to his daughters in the most intimate possible context. But he was going to grieve, and then he was going to stand back up, and he was going to be present, actually present, in a way that he chose rather than simply defaulted to. He had stood back up. He had learned to braid hair. 3 different kinds, 3 different temperaments, 3 different opinions about what the result should look like. He had learned to cook the specific things each daughter needed on the specific kinds of days each daughter had. The soup for when Simone was overwhelmed, the breakfast for dinner that Brianna wanted when something had gone wrong at school, the particular kind of quesadilla that was the only food Cora would reliably eat when she was sad, He had coached Brianna's soccer team for 2 years and sat in the front row of Cora's school plays and driven Simone to early morning tutoring sessions without being asked twice. He had done all of these things imperfectly, because the imperfection was inevitable, but he had done them consistently, and consistency was the thing that mattered. He was sitting at the defense table on the morning of the 14th of November in the second day of jury deliberations, and his daughters were behind him in the gallery, and he had made himself a rule. He was not going to turn around and look at them for reassurance, because looking to his children for reassurance was exactly backwards from how it should work. And even here, even in this situation, he was going to try to keep things oriented correctly. So he felt them rather than saw them, the particular quality of their presence behind him, which he had learned over 17 years with Simone and 14 with Brianna and 9 with Cora, so that the specific combination of the 3 of them in a room with him had a texture he recognized, the way he recognized familiar music. Carol Reeves was at the table beside him, reviewing notes that did not need reviewing, which was her method of managing the specific kind of waiting that arrived at the end of a trial when all the work was done, and the outcome had passed out of everyone's hands and into the hands of 12 strangers in a room down the hall. She had been practicing criminal defense for 22 years, and she had done this waiting many times before, and it had not gotten easier, and she had not expected it to. "How are you holding up?" she asked, not looking up from the papers. "Not fine," Marcus said. "But I'm here. That's all you need to be," she said. At 11:40, he allowed himself to turn around. Simone had the folder open and was reading something inside it. Brianna was sitting with her arms folded, not reading anything, watching the front of the room with the focused attention of a person who had identified a problem and was waiting to see how it resolved. Cora was asleep against Denise's arm with the total unguarded sleep of a child whose body had decided that the best available response to the current situation was unconsciousness. He looked at each of them for a moment. Denise caught his eye and gave him the expression she had been giving him since they were children, the one that said, "I am here. I have not left. I am not going to leave regardless of what happens." He turned back around. At 12:15, the clerk's door opened and the bailiff stepped out. The jury had a question. The question was this. The jury requested to hear again the testimony of Dr. Philip Morrow regarding the timestamps on the flagged transactions. Carol's posture shifted beside Marcus, the specific adjustment that meant something had moved, something had clarified. "Is that good?" he asked. "It means they're focused on the digital evidence," she said quietly. "That's where our argument lives. They're working through the part of the case that could go either way depending on how they read the technical testimony. The readback took 40 minutes. Dr. Morrow's testimony was dense and specific about the metadata in the transaction records, about the gap between when transactions were initiated and when they were authorized, about the characteristics of the login sessions. In plain language, someone had used Marcus's credentials, but the sessions had unfolded inconsistently with Marcus's documented behavior across 3 years. The timing was wrong. The session duration was wrong. The sequence of actions within each session was wrong. Wrong in the specific, technical, documented way that a forensic analyst could identify and set beside the baseline of Marcus's normal behavior. Someone had used his credentials, but the sessions did not look like his sessions. The readback finished. The jury returned to deliberations. At 2:30, during the afternoon recess, Simone came through the low gate at the front of the gallery and sat down next to Marcus at the defense table. The bailiff looked at them. Simone looked at the bailiff with the direct, courteous expression of a person who had thought about whether this was allowed and had decided it was. And the bailiff, after a moment, looked away. She opened the folder on the table between them. "I want to show you something," she said. Inside the folder was a timeline, hand-drawn on graph paper, the dates and events marked in Simone's careful, precise handwriting. It covered the 18 months the prosecution had identified as the period of the alleged fraud. and it also covered the 14 months of legal proceedings. And between those two periods, it was dense with notations and cross-references and color-coding that showed it had been built incrementally over a long time. "I've been tracking everything," she said. "Every hearing, every document disclosure, every piece of evidence they filed, and every piece of evidence Carol introduced. I started in April." She paused. "I know it's not my case. I know it's yours and Carol's. But I needed to feel like I was doing something with what I knew. And what I knew was the documents, because I'd been reading them every time they came in." He looked at her. There was a specific emotion he was managing, and managing badly. The emotion of a parent seeing their child carry something they shouldn't have to carry, and having caused the carrying. "Simone, I'm not done," she said. Not unkindly. Just the particular tone of a person with something specific to say who needs to say it before she is derailed. She pointed to a date in November of the prior year, roughly 9 months before the trial began. Beside it she had written, in letters small enough to fit in the margin, "Deposition of Daniel Firth, 22 pp. Cited in prosecution, Exhibit 14B, not in Defense Discovery Index." Daniel Firth was a systems administrator at the firm, she said. "He resigned 8 months before your arrest, officially voluntary. His deposition is referenced in the prosecution's exhibit index, specifically in their supplementary filing from July. But when I cross-checked it against the discovery index that Carol's office keeps, I couldn't find it listed there." She looked at him. "I've been over the cross-reference 3 times. Either the deposition wasn't provided to the defense, or it was provided in a way that made it very difficult to locate. I don't know which. I might be reading the index wrong." She paused. "But I thought it was worth checking." Marcus looked at his daughter. He looked at the graph paper with its months of careful handwriting. He looked at the notation beside the November date. "Give me the folder," he said. "Let me show Carol." Carol Reeves came back from the recess, and Marcus put the folder in front of her and explained what Simone had found, talking her through the cross-reference and the notation in the same careful way Simone had talked him through it. Carol listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at the timeline for a moment, then took out her laptop and opened a file and scrolled through it with focused attention for 3 minutes. Then she closed the laptop. "Firth's deposition was provided in discovery," she said. Her voice was careful in the way that voices were careful when the person speaking was working through the implications of what they were saying in real time. "It was included in a supplementary exhibit package that came in on a Friday afternoon in July, approximately 6 weeks before trial. The way it was filed, the way it was labeled in the package, it would appear as a duplicate reference to an earlier document if you were scanning the index. If you were doing a standard review of what had been provided, you would not flag it as new material." She paused. "I reviewed that package on the weekend it arrived. I did not catch it." "Your daughter caught it. What's in the deposition?" Marcus asked. "I need to read it to tell you that properly. But based on what I know about Daniel Firth," she stopped. Looked at the folder. "Firth resigned from the firm citing concerns about what he described as irregular patterns in the system access logs. He filed an internal complaint before he left. I knew about the internal complaint. It was in the materials. I did not know there was a formal deposition." She paused again. "I need to make a call." She was out of the room for 21 minutes. When she came back, her expression had changed, not dramatically, but with the specific quality of a woman who's looked at a map and found that one of the roads she thought was a dead-end connects somewhere she needed to go. She sat down. She looked at Marcus. "Firth raised concerns about unauthorized credential use," she said. "He raised them internally, in writing, 4 months before the first of the transactions that formed the basis of the prosecution's case. He was not responded to substantively. He resigned 6 weeks after raising the concerns. His deposition, given to the prosecution during their investigation, contains his account of what he observed and what he reported and what happened when he reported it." She paused. The prosecution had this. They filed it in a way that was technically within discovery requirements and practically very difficult to find. And they built a case against you for 14 months without putting Daniel Firth on the stand. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the courtroom's high windows, the Atlanta afternoon was doing what it did. Carrying on, indifferent. "Can you use it?" Marcus asked. "The jury is deliberating. I can't introduce new testimony. But the deposition isn't evidence. It was filed. It was technically disclosed. If the jury asks a question that allows me to direct their attention to it, or if there are grounds for a mistrial motion that creates a larger proceeding, there are paths forward." She looked at him. "I need to speak to the judge's clerk. Now, before the jury comes back." She stood. Then she paused and looked at the gallery, where Simone had returned to her seat and was sitting with the graph paper timeline folded in her lap, watching the front of the room with the level attention she had been watching things with for 17 years. "Your daughter," Carol said quietly, "found something that I missed. In 8 months of working from her bedroom on a case I've been paid to understand for over a year." She paused. "I need you to know that." Marcus turned and looked at Simone. She was looking back at him with the full, direct attention she had always had, the attention he had watched her develop since she was small. He thought about all the mornings he had driven her to tutoring, and all the evenings he had waited up for her to finish her work. And he thought about what it meant to look at your own child and find something in them that you had given them without realizing what you were giving. He turned back to the front of the room because it was the only way to hold it. "I'd been 14 for 3 months, and in those 3 months, I'd formed some very strong opinions about the American legal system. The main one? It was built for people who already knew the rules. Being a newcomer was like showing up to a game everyone else had been playing for years. They were fluent, moving without thinking while I was still fumbling with the rule book, asking questions that seemed obvious or irrelevant to everyone else. I had opinions about courtrooms, too. The high ceilings were designed to make you feel small. All the procedures were designed to make you feel like you didn't belong unless you already knew them. And the bailiff. I'd been studying his expression for 2 days. It was a masterclass in making you feel like your every question was inappropriate, your every move an inconvenience. The message was clear. Sit still, be quiet, and don't need anything. So that's what I did. I sat still and waited for 2 days. I was so tired of it. My mom died when I was 6. I dealt with it the way I deal with all big things. I break them down. I manage the pieces I can, and the pieces I can't, I put in a container in the back of my mind. I only visit that container when it starts to leak. I remember my mom in scenes, not as a continuous presence. The way she'd genuinely laugh, a real surprise laugh at my dad's terrible jokes. The way she spoke to 6-year-old me like I was a serious person, which I later learned wasn't something all adults did. I remember them dancing in the kitchen on a Thursday evening to a song on the radio for no reason at all. I remember them dancing in the kitchen on a Thursday evening to a song on the radio for no reason at all. I decided those memories were enough. I built on top of them instead of digging them up. Digging cost too much and never brought back more. When Dad was arrested, the cost was enormous and immediate. There was no building around it, no excavating. So I did what I always do with things that are too big. I got organized. I identified what I could control, and I controlled it. I started cooking 3 nights a week so Aunt Denise could rest and my sister Simone could study. I started getting our little sister Cora ready for school on Mondays and Wednesdays. I kept going to soccer practice, not for strategy, but because it was the one place where none of this existed. For 60 minutes, my body was the only problem, and my mind could just stop working. But I couldn't control the jury. I'd thought about it a lot. The jury was 12 people I didn't know, couldn't predict, and couldn't influence. So all I could do was wait. And waiting was the hardest kind of doing nothing I'd ever experienced. On the afternoon of November 14th, The bailiff came over to my dad's lawyer, Carol Reeves, and handed her a folded note. I couldn't read it from where I was sitting, but when Carol read it, her expression changed. It was a small shift, but significant. The kind of change that happens when big information arrives and is being carefully managed. Carol said something to the bailiff, and he headed toward the clerk's office. I leaned toward my aunt. "What's happening?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Wait." So I waited. I watched Carol talk to the clerk, who then went into the judge's chambers. I watched Judge Beaumont come out and take his seat. He looked at the whole room, not just at my dad or the prosecution, but at the situation he was about to address. "I have been informed," the judge said, "that the defense has identified a deposition in the prosecution as discovery materials that may be material to the jury's deliberations." He wanted to hear from both sides. Carol stood up and explained. It was the deposition of a man named Daniel Firth. It was filed in a way that was technically legal, but practically hidden. And it was directly relevant to the case against my dad. Then, the assistant district attorney, Patricia Assay, stood up. I'd been watching her for 2 days. She was precise, professional, and she believed in the case she was building against my father. She wasn't a villain. She was just a person who had looked at the evidence and drawn a wrong conclusion. The problem was, I didn't know if there was any way to show her, or anyone else with power, that she was wrong. The prosecution does not oppose the jury's access to the Firth deposition, Assay said. She said it immediately, without hesitation. After 2 days in this room, I understood what that meant. This was the statement of someone who had just reread her own case and found something she wasn't prepared to find. The judge called a 35-minute recess to make copies for the jury. My little sister Cora woke up from her nap and started asking questions. I answered them honestly, telling her exactly what I knew and nothing more. "Will Daddy come home tonight?" she asked. She has our father's eyes. Eyes that want the real answer and would know if they got anything else. "I don't know," I told her. "I really don't know yet. Something is happening. I think it might be good. But I don't know." Cora thought about that. "But maybe," she said. "Maybe?" I said. "Yes, maybe." At 3:40, the jury came back. They filed in, carrying the shared weight of 2 days spent in a room together. The foreperson, a man in his 50s, sat down without looking at my dad's table. You could read that sign either way. The judge asked the questions. The foreperson confirmed the verdict had been reached. The clerk stood up. "Count 1, wire fraud in the first degree, not guilty. Count 2, wire fraud in the second degree, not guilty. Count 3, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, not guilty." The courtroom fell silent. I sat completely still for a moment. Then I buried my face in my hands, needing the privacy of not being seen. The past 14 months were finally releasing from my body. A total collapse now that the holding was finally over. Cora reached for me. I lifted my head and pulled my sister into a hug, holding her tight. At the defense table, my dad pressed his hands flat on the wood, looking down at them as if checking to see if they were real. Marcus stood. He turned around. Cora came first. She was 9 years old, and she did not have the composure that her sisters had built over years of managing this, and she did not try to have it. She crossed the distance between the gallery and the defense table at a full run. The run of a child who has been sitting still for 2 days and is finally allowed to move. And Marcus caught her and held her with the encompassing hold of a parent who has been separated from their child and is relearning the particular weight of them, the specific way their body fit against his, the cedar smell of his own coat against her hair. Cora said his name once against his shoulder, not loudly, just said it in the way that names were sometimes the only word that held everything you wanted to say. Brianna came next. She walked because she was Brianna, and she was 14, and she had her own specific dignity. That was not about distance, but about the form the reunion took, about doing it in her own way, rather than the way available emotion would have dictated. She walked to her father, and she put both arms around him, and she pressed her face into his shoulder, and he held her. And he could feel in the way he held her the particular release of a person who has been carrying something alone for too long and is finally putting it down, because someone is finally there to share the weight. Simone waited. She always waited. She was the oldest, and she had always been the one who watched the room and made sure everyone else was okay before she attended to her own portion of things. And she stood at the gallery rail now with the folder under her arm and watched her father hold Cora and then hold Brianna. And she watched with the expression she had been wearing for 14 months. The expression that was 17 and also much older. The expression of a person who had taken on responsibility. They had not been given the option to decline and had been carrying it with a competence that looked like composure, but was something more effortful and more real. When Marcus looked up over Brianna's shoulder and found Simone's eyes, she held up the folder. He laughed. It was involuntary and complete, and it was the first time he had laughed in a courtroom in 14 months. And the sound of it was the sound of a man becoming, in the space of a single moment, fully himself again after a long period of being only the managed version of himself. He reached out his hand. She came through the gate and took it, and he pulled her in, and for a moment, all three of them were there at once. The three of them and their father, in the crowded, impractical, entirely necessary configuration of a family that had held on through 14 months and had not let go. At the bench, Judge Harold Beaumont watched this. He had been a judge for 19 years. In 19 years, he had watched families in every possible configuration of the emotions that courtrooms produced. The grief of families at sentencing, the relief of families at acquittal, the specific complicated grief of families at acquittal when the trial had revealed things that the verdict did not resolve. He had watched people find out in the space of a sentence that their life was going in one direction rather than another. He had watched this so many times that he had developed, necessarily, the professional capacity to observe without being moved. Not the absence of feeling. He was not without feeling, but the management of feeling. The containment of it, the ability to be present without being consumed, which was the quality that allowed him to do the work over 19 years without being destroyed by it. He was watching Marcus Washington in the well of his courtroom, holding his three daughters, and the management was failing. It failed quietly. It failed in the specific way that things failed when the load they were designed to manage exceeded the design, not catastrophically, not with any visible external collapse, but with the particular private failure that produced a pressure behind the eyes and a movement in the throat and the necessity of looking down for a moment at the surface of the bench. He looked down. He gave himself a moment. He thought about the folder in the 17-year-old's hands. He thought about the 45 minutes he had spent that afternoon reading Daniel Firth's deposition after the parties flagged the issue and copies were being prepared for the jury, reading it with the specific, careful attention he brought to things that mattered and finding in it the shape of something he recognized, the shape of a warning that had been given and not heeded, the shape of a man who had tried to do the right thing and had been filed in a supplementary package on a Friday afternoon in July, in a way that was technically compliant and practically invisible, and had stayed invisible for 14 months while a different man was tried for the thing the warning had been about. He thought about what it meant that a 17-year-old going through legal documents on graph paper had found the thing that everyone else, the defense, the prosecution, the court, had not found. Had found it quietly in her bedroom over 8 months without telling anyone except her father when she was certain enough to show him. He thought about 3 girls walking into his courtroom that morning. The one with the folder, carrying it with the deliberate steadiness of someone who had made that steadiness structural. The one with the set jaw, carrying her father's expression on her face without knowing she was carrying it. The one holding her sister's hand with both of hers, being exactly what she was without apology. He thought about the 14 months and what the 14 months had cost. and he thought about the particular injustice of being right about something in the most important possible sense and having to wait for a long time while the world organized itself toward confirming it. He was not a sentimental man. He had not been a sentimental man for most of his life, and the bench had not made him one. If anything, the bench had made him more rigorous about the distinction between the true and the affecting, and between the right and the merely sympathetic. He did not cry in courtrooms. He pressed his lips together and looked at the surface of his bench and the water glass beside his notes, and he gave himself the moment he needed. Then he looked up. The family was still together in the well of the court. Marcus had his arms around all three of them in the specific, impractical way that required everyone to adjust to accommodate everyone else, the geometry of a family rather than a photograph. Carol Reeves was standing slightly to the side with the expression of a woman who had been doing this for 22 years and had not lost the capacity to find the good endings good. Judge Beaumont waited until Marcus looked up and found him. "Mr. Washington," he said. His voice was steady. He was a careful man, and he had given himself a moment, and his voice was steady. "Take your daughters home." The drive home was quiet in the way that things were quiet when the silence was full rather than empty. Not the silence of nothing to say, but the silence of too much. The silence of people who have been through something large together and are still inside it even though it is technically over. Denise drove. Marcus sat in the passenger seat and watched the Atlanta streets pass and thought about Daniel Firth. They had located him that afternoon, while Carol was completing the post-trial paperwork, and the girls were in the hallway eating from the vending machines that Brianna had identified on the first day as a logistical resource. Firth had moved to Charlotte 18 months ago. He was 31 years old, and he had spent the better part of 2 years believing he had done what he was supposed to do, raised concerns through the proper channels, provided a deposition when investigators came asking, trusted the system to take what he had given it and do the right thing with it. He had not known what had been done with what he gave. When Carol reached him by phone and told him, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to be its own kind of testimony. He said he was sorry, that he should have pushed harder, that if he had known, he would have done more. Carol had told him, "You did what you could with what you had. The rest was on other people." Marcus did not think about Firth with anger, which surprised him. He thought he should feel anger at Firth, at the prosecutors who had filed the deposition in the way it was filed, at the firm's management who had not acted on the internal complaint, at the entire machinery that had taken a warning and buried it, and then built a case around the problem the warning had been pointing to. He thought he should feel that anger, and he did not, or not yet. What he felt was the specific exhaustion that came after sustained composure had been maintained for a long time and was no longer required. The exhaustion of the long-held breath finally released. The anger would come later. He was experienced enough with himself to know that it would come and that it would need somewhere to go, and that somewhere would need to be more constructive than the available targets. But later was not now. In the back seat, Cora had fallen asleep between her sisters with the total, immediate sleep of a child whose body had been waiting for the tension to lift and had taken the first available moment to do so. She was leaning against Simone, her head tipped sideways, her hands relaxed in her lap in the specific way of someone who had let go of something they had been holding. Brianna had her arm around Cora from the other side. Simone had her head against the window and was watching the city go by with the expression of someone who was thinking about a great many things and was not yet ready to sort them into categories. Marcus watched the city go by on his side of the car. He had grown up in Atlanta, in a neighborhood that no longer looked the way it had looked when he was growing up in it. The way Atlanta neighborhoods generally no longer looked the way they had looked 20 or 30 years ago. The city was always in the process of becoming something, which was partly its energy and partly its cost, and he had always felt both of those things about it, the aliveness of it and the price of the aliveness. He had built his life in it. He had made his career in it. He had met his wife here, and lost her here, and raised his daughters here, and it had never occurred to him to leave even in the hardest years, because leaving would have meant something about impermanence that he had decided not to accept. Denise turned onto their street. The neighborhood moved past the windows, the houses with their porch lights on against the November dark. The particular quality of the street at this hour, familiar in the way that the streets of the place you have lived the longest were familiar, and then their house. The porch light was on. The azalea his wife had planted was dormant and dark against the front step, but was still there, still holding the space she had put it in. The windows were lit from inside. Denise had left lights on before they left that morning. The specific act of someone who understood that coming home to a dark house was its own small additional difficulty. Marcus got out of the car and stood in the driveway. He had not been back to this house since the Tuesday morning in September 14 months ago when he had driven away from it to go to his office and had not made it to his office. He had not understood, in the months since, exactly why the house had occupied such a specific and painful place in what he had lost. Why not being in this house had been, in some ways, as acute as any of the other losses the situation had produced. But standing in the driveway in the November evening, he thought he understood it now. The house was the record of a life assembled intentionally. The house contained the evidence of who he was, and what he had chosen, and what he had built, and whom he had built it for. To be separated from, it was not just to be separated from a building. It was to be separated from the visible proof of yourself. He was walking back toward it now, and it looked the same from the outside, which was the right way for it to look. Brianna had gotten Cora out of the back seat and was carrying her, barely managing it. Cora being a 9-year-old of solid build, who was not helping with the process, but managing it anyway with the specific determination of a person who had decided this was what was happening. Cora had her arms around Brianna's neck and was the particular kind of awake that looked like sleep from a distance. Simone stood beside the car with the folder under her arm. She had carried it all day, through the security checkpoint and through the hours of waiting and through the verdict, and now here, in the driveway, in the dark. "You should keep that," Marcus said. "It's your case documents. It's 8 months of your work. Keep it." She looked at the folder for a moment, then tucked it more securely under her arm. She looked at the house. Then she looked at him. "I have something I want to say," she said, "out here. Before we go in, say it," he said. "I tracked the case because I needed to do something real. Not because I thought I would find anything. I just needed to feel like I wasn't completely outside of it." She paused. "When I found the first notation, I didn't know if it mattered. I didn't know if I was reading the index wrong or if there was some explanation I didn't understand. I just knew it was a thing I couldn't account for, and that it seemed like a thing worth checking." She looked at him. "I was scared the whole time that I was wrong, that I'd bring it to you, and it would turn out to be nothing, and I would have made things harder instead of better. But you brought it anyway," he said. "You needed someone looking at the whole picture," she said. "That's what you always told us. When something is wrong, you don't look away from it. You look at the whole picture, and you find what you missed. I was just doing what you taught us to do." Marcus stood in the driveway of his house on the 14th of November and looked at his oldest daughter, and he thought about all the years of driving her to tutoring and sitting up while she worked, and the 100 small investments he had made in her specific kind of intelligence. And he thought about what it meant to have given someone something and then to have had that something turned toward you, used for you, in the moment when you needed it most. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder. "Come inside," he said. She walked through the front door, and he followed her, and he closed the door behind them. The house had the quality of a space that had been carefully maintained in the absence of its primary occupant. Everything in order, everything where it belonged, but with the slight suspended quality of a place that has been waiting, that has been managed rather than lived in, and that was now, finally, going to become something other than managed. Denise went directly to the kitchen. The sound of her starting to cook began immediately. the particular percussion of a woman who moved through a kitchen from memory, who did not need to think about what she was doing with her hands because the hands knew. It was the right sound to be the first sound of the house becoming itself again. Cora had been deposited on the couch and made the transition from carried to sitting upright with the adaptability of a 9-year-old who could sleep in a moving car and be fully awake 4 minutes later. She was looking around the room with the alert quality of a child who is confirmed that something good has definitely happened and is now taking stock. "Are you hungry?" she asked Marcus. "Very," he said. "Aunt Denise is making something. I can tell by the sound." "What sound is it?" "The onion sound," Cora said with authority. "She does onions first and then everything else. When it's the onion sound, it means a real meal." Marcus sat down on the couch beside her. Cora leaned against him immediately. Not her full weight, but the specific portion of it that said here just enough to be present, the lean of a child who has done this 10,000 times and knows its exact grammar. Marcus put his arm around her and looked at the room. The familiar walls, the lamplight, the photographs on the sideboard that were the photographs of 10 years of a family being itself. Brianna came downstairs with the expression of someone who had found her room unchanged and was processing the specific relief of unchanged things in a period of change. She sat on the arm of the couch and looked at her father with the direct measuring look she had been giving him since she was 8. The look that evaluated whether a person was actually okay or only presenting okay. "You look better," she said. "I am better. You should eat." "You haven't eaten since this morning." She said it as a statement and an instruction, because Brianna's caring took the form of instructions. "I'll set the table." She went to the kitchen. From the kitchen came the sound of both Denise and Brianna, the particular two-person rhythm they had developed over 2 years of cooking in the same space, moving around each other with the efficiency of people who had found the accommodation. Simone came and sat in the reading chair across the room, the one she had claimed at 12, her spot for the combination of reading and watching the room that was her default mode of presence. She set the folder on the side table and looked at her father. "What happens now?" she asked. "Carol files the final motions. The investigation continues, the real one, into who actually did it. There will be civil proceedings for the clients whose money was moved. I'll cooperate with everything." He paused. "It will take time. Are you angry?" He considered this honestly. "Not tonight. I think the anger is there, and it will come when the exhaustion moves out of the way. But right now I'm just here, in this room. That's enough for tonight." Cora had been listening with the focused attention she brought to adult conversations she understood were important, which was most adult conversations. "I have something to show you," she said. She got the composition notebook from the side table beside the couch. She had placed it there before they left that morning, because she had decided she was going to bring it even though she didn't know if she would use it. And she had decided that when she came home, she wanted it to be in this spot, as though it had been waiting. She sat back down beside her father and opened it to the page at the top of which she had written, 6 weeks ago. "What I want to say, I was going to read this in the courtroom," she said, as a statement, but they didn't need it, which is good. "But I still want you to hear it." "I want to hear it," he said. "It's not perfect. I've been working on it for 6 weeks. That's fine. Read it anyway." She read it. It was 3 paragraphs. The first was about waffles. The Saturday waffles with too much vanilla extract. The ones he made because he had decided vanilla was the most important ingredient and you couldn't overdo the most important ingredient. She had written it not as an anecdote, but as something she had understood about him from those waffles, that he was a person who knew what mattered and put it in first and put in more than was strictly necessary. The second paragraph was about a parking lot. A day in 3rd grade when she had failed a multiplication test and cried in the car, and he had pulled over and gotten in the back seat and just been there. Not fixing it, not making it smaller, just being next to her until that was enough. She had written, "I understood that day that being next to someone is not nothing. It is sometimes everything. The third paragraph was about a midnight. A night she had come downstairs for water and found him at the kitchen table with a photograph of their mother, not knowing she was there. She had watched him and understood, with the specific understanding of a child who pays full attention, that her father was a person who had built an entire life around a missing that had not gone away. She had written, "I think that is what love is when it is real. It keeps building even when the person it is for is gone. You kept building. You kept building for us." The room was quiet when she finished. Marcus sat beside his youngest daughter, and he thought about what it meant that a 9-year-old, in the middle of the hardest year of the family's life, had been sitting in her room writing about waffles and parking lots and midnight kitchen tables, trying to find the language for what she knew about him. He thought about the folder on the side table beside Simone's chair and 8 months of graph paper inside it. He thought about Brianna in the kitchen right now, setting the table with particular care. He thought about Denise, who had come to stay the night the arrest happened and had not left. He had built this, not alone. Nothing was built by one person. But he had started it, and he had maintained it, and he had refused, through the years that could have made refusal reasonable, to stop. The not falling apart had been a choice he made every morning, and the choice had accumulated into something that was sitting beside him now in the form of a 9-year-old with a composition notebook, and standing in the kitchen in the form of a 14-year-old setting the table, and sitting across the room in the form of a 17-year-old with a folder that had changed the outcome of a trial. He had not known, while he was making those choices, what he was building. You did not know. You only found out later, when it was already built, when you discovered that it had held. "Cora," he said. Yes, that was exactly right. Every word. She closed the notebook with the satisfied expression of someone who has said what they needed to say and had it received correctly. Then she leaned back against him, and Simone looked up from her phone and met his eyes, and Brianna appeared in the kitchen doorway and said dinner. They went to the table. Denise had made the meal, the big one, the one that took up both pots and most of the counter, the one whose smell meant, "This is real. This is happening." She set everything on the table and looked at her brother, Marcus. "Welcome home," she said. "Thank you," he replied. "For all of it." She looked at his daughters. "Thanked them. I just kept the lights on. You kept a great deal more than the lights on. Let's eat," she said, reaching for a pot. And they did. The conversation drifted, as it does over dinner. They talked about ordinary things. Cora's school drama, Brianna's critique of her soccer coach, and Simone's gentle question about when Denise might move back to her own apartment, a question that held many meanings. The case was in the room, it would always be, but it wasn't at the table. At the table, there was food, 5 people, and the special sound of a family, apart for so long, finally being itself again. It was fuller, more aware, more deliberately present in the simple act of being together. Later, after dinner, Simone found her father in the kitchen washing dishes. She picked up a towel and stood beside him, drying as he washed, in silence. It was their rhythm, a father and daughter who no longer needed to fill the space between them. For them, the silence itself was company. After a while, she spoke. "I was so scared, I know," he said. "Not just of the verdict. I was scared the whole time that I was wrong about you. That I decided you were innocent because you were my father, and I couldn't see it clearly." She paused. "I kept reading the evidence, coming back to the same conclusion, and asking myself if I was reading it that way because it was true, or because I needed it to be true." "Which did you decide?" he asked. "I decided I was reading it correctly," she said. "And then I kept reading it again just to check." He looked at her. "How many times?" "May," she said, almost smiling. That specific smile of someone who has been serious for a very long time and is just starting to let go. He handed her the next dish. "You were right," he said. "For what it's worth, coming from me, you were reading it correctly." "I know," she said. "I know that now. How does it feel?" She thought about it. Like something that was tight for a long time and is now loose, she said. And I don't know yet what to do with the space that was under the tightness. That will take some time. Yes, she said. I expect it will. She dried the last dish and said good night. Marcus turned off the kitchen light, standing in the dark for a moment, listening to the house settle, the floorboards creaking upstairs, the distant sound of a TV, the silence of a house with people sleeping in it, sounds of fullness, of the specific people who were supposed to be there, finally being there. He had been away for 14 months. The house had kept its shape. His daughters had kept theirs, and more, they had grown into fuller versions of themselves. He thought about what his lawyer told him, that the judge had barely held it together after the verdict. A man who'd spent 19 years on the bench, moved by 3 girls in his court. He had never taught them to perform love, to make it visible for others. He taught them to do what matters, to show up for the people they loved, to tell the truth, and to keep going. And they did. They did it privately, without knowing if anyone would see or if it would even matter. They did it because he was their father, and they were his daughters. And a judge had seen it. Marcus thought, that is what it looks like when it is real. Not the performance, the actual thing. He went to bed. For the first time in a long time, he slept without the weight of the next day pressing on him. He slept with the depth of someone who had been holding their breath for 14 months and has finally let it go. Outside, the November night was quiet. The porch light was on. The azalea his wife had planted stood by the front step, dormant and dark, waiting for spring. It would come. Spring always came. He had always known it. He just hadn't been able to feel it for a long time. But now he felt it.